Gracias.
Teraz jest okay?
Good afternoon, everyone. It's my pleasure to welcome today a very special guest, Professor Paweł Frelik, the Director of American Studies Center at our university. Paweł is an expert in science fiction, video games, and today he's going to present us his findings about the intersection of video games and astronomy or planetary sciences. So Paweł's research career went through Poland and the United States, and now he's at the Astronomical Observatory to share his knowledge about this topic. So thank you for getting our invitation. So yeah.
Thank you so much. You know, it is kind of a pinnacle of my career. I can go and retire after that, maybe. And of course, you know, talking about, I do work a lot with science fiction and especially in visual media. And I am interested, among other things, in how various real or fictional science is represented in various media of science fiction. But of course, I have a little bit of an imposter syndrome talking to the actual scientists rather than, you know, reading things or watching things that sort of pretend to be science. Yeah, so I'd like to talk about, those intersections between video games and what I call planetary sciences. And at various points, you know, this will practically mean either astronomy, astrophysics, or various aspects connected to planetary systems at kind of all levels, and how, on the one hand, the medium of video games, which of course has good reasons, depending on the quarters, but it may have a pretty bad reputation. So how many people have a very dim view of video games here? Okay, okay. Oh, you're kind of a token. Okay, thank you. But and you know, other than that, you know, very serious sciences. So there is, of course, a whole bunch of things that one could say about these things, and you know, we don't have enough time to cover it. But I'll try to sort of point out why it makes sense, or why it's not a complete waste of time to actually look at astronomy or astrophysics or planetary sciences in this medium. And rather untypically, I'll start at the very end. So I'll start with the examples, and then I'll sort of move on to actual larger, more theoretical points, so kind of a justifications. So if you, okay, I'll be doing that then. No? Okay, maybe, we'll see. Okay, that works out. So if you go to Steam, which is probably the largest online store for video games, and you enter space, which is of course a very general word, right? You will actually come up with something like over almost 23,000 hits. They don't have to be the actual, that doesn't mean that there are 23,000 games that have space or some sort of derivative of space in the title, but that's a lot. Of course, not all of them will be in any way related or concerned with the universe or outer space, but a lot of them will be. And of course, space features very prominently, primarily, not surprisingly, in what we broadly could call science fiction video games, and very often kind of the universe, galaxies, or star systems feature in all kinds of games that could be described, for instance, as space opera. So one really famous example would be, for instance, the trilogy of Mass Effect, which has been arguably one of the most famous and one of the strongest narratively, where, of course, it's a role-playing game, so you kind of play this essentially savior of a galaxy. It sounds really silly. And there are ways in which it's not a silly game, but the kind of a basic narrative premise is pretty silly. But part of the experience of playing the game is just kind of going around partly or largely fictional galaxy, which is sort of kind of like Milky Way, but not really. There's a lot of made up star systems and planets and so on. But, you know, that sort of going around and doing various missions as part of the gameplay, which is otherwise very good. Another example of a game that uses this time an entirely fictional universe, but space would be EVE Online, massively multiplayer online game, in which you fight, trade, develop all kinds of technologies. So it's really, the game has been called like a kind of a trying ground for the future corporate elites, because you need to be extremely competitive. The entry level is very high, and essentially, if you don't have a know-how, you're going to get killed, and you lose your starship and everything that you had in it, and you have to start from scratch. But all of this kind of happens sort of against the backdrop of this kind of a fictional universe, and travel between various star systems is one of the elements of gameplay. And for many players, both with Mass Effect and EVE Online, and these are really famous examples, but there are dozens, if not hundreds of games like that. But many players, when they talk about why they like these titles, particularly, they also, they kind of confess that they like the size of that universe, and that apart from all that fighting and collecting and crafting, you know, the actual experience, which is not real time, of course, the time scales are very radically squished, but the fact that you have to fly around and land on various planets and, you know, do various missions is actually one of the kind of draws of these games and kind of similar titles. But of course, these games are, this is, as I mentioned, the kind of titles in which the space is a kind of a backdrop, or it's not really even a very important part of the gaming experience. But there are a lot of games that hew very closely to the actual scientific principles, and you could kind of group them in sort of several clusters of those, for instance, that are really scientific. And so, for instance, one of those really faithful or genuine games would be Kerbal Space Program. And if you look at the sort of characters, that looks like kind of a children's game, and it's actually not. The game is what the title kind of promises to be, which is about achieving space capacity and then launching and landing. But in order to actually successfully play that game, you do need to have, you need to know the principles, and the game can teach you that, and it's kind of a basic form. Of course, it is a simplified form, but, you know, orbital mechanics, there's a lot of actual rocket science, gravity assist, like re-entry heat. So even though you're kind of flying this cartoonish rocket around the planet, you actually have to contend with real science. And in fact, NASA has used Kerbal Space Program in a lot of its kind of a public dissemination, kind of outreach programs, because of how rigorous it is in terms of science. Another very interesting and a very different game, or some people question whether it is a game rather than kind of interactive software, is Universe Sandbox, which is essentially what the title promises to be. It's a simulation of a universe in which you can construct and perform various sort of astronomical operations, from building planets, simulating gravity with all the consequences. You can collide them, you can create your own systems, although some of the principles of that creation are the actual science as we know it. You can model also at the sort of lower level planetary climates, and these, for instance, depend on, I don't know, the axis tilt and, you know, the gravity and other things. So it is really like the universe simulation, which has been known for its sort of faithfulness to physics, to science again, as we know it. Yet another, and this is an example of a game which is sort of less rigorous, but still sort of respects some of the basic principles, is Outer Wilds, which, again, although a lot of the action of the game happens on the surface of this, again, it's slightly kind of like animated cartoon, animated movie in terms of visual style, but you do have one of the things that you do is you have to escape the planet before it undergoes this kind of a massive catastrophe. It's never really quite clear what it is, and you have a kind of time. And in order to do that, before you get off the planet, and presumably your population as you construct your rockets and you devise your in-game space program, you have again to take into account fairly, not rigorously, but fairly realistic orbital mechanics and sort of things like gravitational influence and so on. So these would be examples of games that sort of stick more or less faithfully, very often less than more, but still believably to the actual principles of science. One other sort of cluster or a big group of games that is very interesting from this perspective is something that we could call large universes. And there's a number of games which, again, ostensibly they may be about trading or fighting or building empires or just kind of exploring, but they boast, and this is one of the sort of their main claims to fame, boast really large universes. And what does that mean? A perfect example of that would be No Man's Sky, which by now is an old game, 9 years old, which when it came out originally in 2016 was actually, it's not really, it was advertised as a space exploration game, but it was really existential crisis simulator, and I'll get to why this could push players into existential crisis. No Man's Sky is really interesting because it has been continuously updated for the last 9 years. Which I don't even know how that really works out for them in terms of a business model, because you don't pay for these updates. And they are churning out 4 of those a year. So we are nearing 40 major updates that add various, both again, sort of space-related aspects, but there was one huge update which developed on all the planets, about which in a second, the underwater biomes and exploration, the whole kind of underwater component. What is remarkable about No Man's Sky is this number. It's a fairly big number. It's above 18 quintillion. And this is the number of planets and moons that are present in that game. They are, of course, procedurally generated, but they are generated based on actual scientific principles. One of the people who worked or who assisted the developers, the company is British, but they somehow secured back in, a decade ago, the services of Kip Thorne, obviously a Nobel Prize winner in physics, who helped them model both the kind of star systems, but all of these 18 quintillion planets and moons are landable, meaning as you begin in your little spaceship, in theory, I mean, there is travel involved. You can land, of course, we'll never have time, and the sun will burn out before we'll be able to land on. But you can land them. All of them have sort of interlocked and fairly complex geospheres, biospheres, and atmospheres, and what you do actually affects the remaining. So if you, I don't know, start chopping off the trees on one of the planets and you do it for long enough on a massive scale, actually the atmosphere of the planet will start to change. So this is, as I said, really scientifically, it's fictional, of course. The entire universe is fictional, but it actually obeys the laws of various planetary sciences as we know them. And visually it is sort of slightly on the sort of surreal side, very not hyper realistic. So there is a slight kind of a maybe cartoonish feel to it. But even visually, you have a reflection of those. The flora and fauna does depend, or will have, for instance, different colors, different feeding patterns depending on the availability of water, or depending on the makeup of the atmosphere, and so on and so forth. So it is incredibly complex. But the main claim to fame is 18 quintillion places you can actually go around. Another game like that with a large universe is Space Engine, which again, the sort of subtitle universe simulator kind of tells you what it's about. Is anyone familiar with this one? Because I've been told that it is known in some astronomical circles, clearly not widely enough, but it's fictional I mean, not fictional, but it's in-game universe. And again, large parts of it are procedurally generated, is the entire observable universe, including the actual distances. And you don't, in Space Engine, you don't play any particular figure, whereas you have this kind of a disembodied person / starship as you kind of travel from system to system. Where we have uncharted system, they are procedurally added, but the game / software relies on astronomical catalogs, and it's very rigorous, and apparently it is used in some places as a kind of a visualization tool in the actual scientific research, even though some parts of it will be sort of filled in where we don't have accurate data. Yet another one, this is the last example here, and it's kind of the most action-oriented. So there are, again, things that you can do, again, as usual, trade, build, explore, fight, and all these kind of things. After all, this is commercial. These are all commercial titles, right? Commercial would be Elite Dangerous, where it's slightly smaller, so you have only entire Milky Way. But again, that still means that in theory, you can travel to any of 400 billion star systems and do things in them. And that includes, in many cases, landing on these planets and so forth. And again, largely where we have data, it does rely on the actual astrophysical information data that we have. Although it is, I stress that it's a fully commercial game title of the same kind as, I don't know, shooting games or anything else. Last but not least, and I'll be finishing with my examples, which I started with, would be there are entire game genres or game groupings that somehow invoke various aspects of planetary sciences. One of them, for instance, are planetary colonization games. And the name itself kind of explains, what they are about, although there's a subset, but it's all focused and obsessed with Mars, not the only people on this planet who are, for better or for worse. But in planetary colonization games, which, it's really several dozen of these titles, the basic premise is you land on this fictional planet, which is usually, again, imagined in fair detail, including its, mineral deposits, the atmosphere, the biological life, and so on. And you're supposed to establish a colony, which of course puts you in this position of, like the explorer of the 18th century or 17th century. But in many of them, and there are differences between various titles here in that category, but in many of them, what you do and how you decide to develop your colony will have consequences on the planetary systems, most notably on the biosphere and the atmosphere. And depending on whether you pursue more aggressive extractionist politics or sort of more balanced or ecological, whatever that means in these specific titles. So, but again, it's of course, maybe not the kind of a star system level, but some of them can be fairly detailed in, if not imitating, at least simulating the kinds of dependencies and the complexity of the actual celestial bodies. So these would be the example, and you could ask, okay, maybe some of these, look interesting, or maybe not, or maybe you will recommend that to your children if you have them, and if they have patience for exploring 18 quintillion planets rather than shooting some aliens, right? But of course, why are these things interesting, or why it makes sense to pay attention to fictional, more or less fictional video games that are about space, about planetary, about planets, about star systems, and so on. And there are several ways to approach that question. One is kind of being, it's very visible, being Captain Obvious, and this is the kind of something that would very easily sell if, I don't know, as myself, as a kind of a cultural studies researcher, if I wanted to get money out of NASA, European Space Agency, and do something with games, I would go to them and say something like that, some of these games, although there's an argument if Some of them are games rather than kind of interactive software that does something, although they look kind of like games. But it also depends how you define a game, whether it needs to have a win or lose condition or sort of progress. But some of these games could be examples of kind of a citizen science where, you know, as you play a game, you at the same time sort of crunching some numbers, some of these crowdsourced projects that we know from genetics, for instance, but there are have been several to do with identifying, for instance, galaxies based on, I think, the Observatory in New Mexico, where you are shown images and kind of given a shorthand identification key, and of course this is all verified. So you can say it's a citizen science and helps crunch data. It's kind of a distributed computing. So that's of course sexy. You could say that some of these are very rigorous in their visualization, so they could have a sort of didactic potential, especially as we want to spread the awareness especially in our societies, right? I mean, there are so many things going wrong here between AI and genetics. So convincing people, yeah, you need to care about what is out there beyond our planet is not an easy task. And of course, games could be a good way to do that, especially when they are rigorous. And again, in more generally, I would probably say hypothetically, to these NASA or European Space Agency that, as a sort of way of engaging the public, promoting STEM, programs and general sort of commitment of societies to science. Games are probably a very good way to do that. It's kind of a new dynamic medium that in some ways, it is generational, of course, but in some ways feels sexier to a certain generation than, for instance, film or television, although they can do very similar things. So that's a kind of a Captain Obvious response why we should sort of care or pay attention to some of these games. But there is another way, and this is where I'm entering my territory. So I hope if I lose anyone, just kind of a shout or raise your hand or somehow give me some sign. But there is a way that is grounded in cultural studies and how culture in general, and of course science in a certain way, is very much part of culture, even if it depends on the actual numbers and data that exist regardless of culture. And one way of talking about that, of sort of framing these, let's call them astronomical video games, although this is not a category or label that anyone would use, but just as a kind of a shorthand for now. So that's that. But we could start talking. One way to talk about it is in terms of what Sheila Yasanov calls socio-technical imaginaries. And this is a kind of a quote from the book, from the introduction to the book that she co-wrote. But the general argument for something that she calls socio-technical imaginaries would go something like that, that no instance of science, politics, or things that seem to be very hard, kind of a tangible, exists definitely in Western, but you could make an argument really any kind of society, without this sort of very broad and very sometimes indistinct sphere that she calls an imaginary, which would be all kinds of beliefs and stories and narratives that we say about things like science and technology, for instance. Some of these stories may present themselves as sort of factual, right? Some of them will be entirely fictional, but they do shape how we think about things, and that also includes, hard sciences, and that also includes astrophysics or astronomy and other sciences. Now, of course, when we talk about astronomy and astrophysics, one sort of obvious place in culture where a lot of this has been happening, at least for a century, would be the genre that we know as science fiction. And we don't need to go, how we actually define science fiction. That's not really important. And of course, it has changed over the last 100 of years. But you could, people have made that argument that a lot of science fiction is literally very close to science. There are some science fiction writers who are actually themselves physicists, mathematicians, and so on. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it's better science fiction that, I don't know, the one written by complete, layman. Or for instance, if you remember that movie, The Martian with Matt Damon, it seemed to be, I don't know, maybe not to you, but it seemed to be at least believable in terms of, how it presented the conditions on Mars. But of course, the author, whose name, of course, I don't remember. Andy Weir, yeah. So he was, I think, as I remember, he was a software engineer at Microsoft or somewhere. So it's not like he had a training in, I don't know, Martian science, right, or anything. But so it doesn't really matter. There is some science fiction, regardless of the medium, that also includes video games that, as I showed, is really sort of rigorous. There is some other that relies more on imagination. But of course, science fiction is only one of such areas, one of the locations of these, what Yasanov calls socio-technical imaginaries. And actually, it's surrounded by a whole bunch of others, some of which people don't really think about as speculative or involved in science. And they are sort of really, really super diverse. So you would have, of course, other kinds of science, other kinds of art. So there are entire artistic movements that somehow took science, as they are one of their parameters. And of course, futurists are obvious, but very few people are actually aware that surrealists of their wild imagination were actually, a lot of them, surrealist artists were actually very much informed of what was happening at that point, which was early 20th century in sciences. So they were inspired sometimes fairly directly by things like quantum physics and relativity theory and so on and so forth. Right. So some of these are obvious, but there are some others which people don't usually associate, but in which some kind of thinking about typically a future, but a lot of thinking about the future is tied to thinking about science, about technology, both in terms of kind of extrapolation, but also imagining other sort of thought experiments. Right. So you would have, I don't know, amusement parks. You could ask, what are we doing here? In the United States, since the 1950s, there has been no self-respecting amusement park. So every major Disney always had a section which was about the future. And usually it was, of course, sold like the House of the Future in Epcot in the 1950s, for instance. But, somehow involved, of course, on the scale that was suitable for people who visit Disney parks. But it was sort of involved, what will the kitchen, right, in 2025, this is from a perspective of 1950s, would look like, and what kind of technologies would be available, at home, right? On a completely less serious thing, and again, this is really an American thing, like if you think about all kinds of UFO cults and, of course, Scientology, which emerged with Dianetics, which is weird, quasi-religious, quasi-spiritual systems. But at the core, they sort of claimed various kinds of usually fictional sort of parasciences that kind of informing what they were, how they were thinking about the world or societies. Or again, it's a completely different perspective, but that has been really popular in the last 10 years. So the rise of what we call foresight and futures planning, of course, attached to the business ventures where you kind of bet capital on various things that may or may not happen in the future and sort of weighing the risk and, what return on investment. I mean, some of these, what they call derivatives, really require a PhD in mathematics, but, there are people who actually make a lot of money in that. But the basic thinking at the core of that is also something that is not that much different from science fiction. It just serves a completely different purpose. So the whole point of these, and I'll be, happy to talk more about how these connect, is that they're all places in culture where those different imaginaries, because there is no one single socio-technical imaginary, but all revolve around thinking about the future in science and technology. But they give very different answers to very different visions, depending on the context from which they come. But also, which again, people don't usually know about, there has been more than enough sort of exchange or communication between them, both in terms of inspiration and borrowing, but also how they read. So for instance, like here at the bottom, you have this initial public offerings of the stock market, financial prospectuses, where you prepare when you go, when you start on the stock market, you need to prepare the documentation, which will convince people to give you your money, right? A lot of that, if you look at some of those, especially in the areas like, until recently, AI or genetics, some of it really read as science fiction, and actually not even very sort of humble science fiction. Some of it was really, really wild. But in the American system, that's okay. This is in the context of IPO documentation, it's called forward thinking, you know. I would call it speculation or really making up SF stuff. We call it forward thinking. Forward thinking is actually protected legally. So even if you invest in them and they don't deliver, you can't sue them, you know, to get your money back. So it's a kind of an instance of writing a sort of science fiction that you can get money from other people, and you're not legally responsible if you don't actually, develop something that you kind of promised in this sort of narrative. So the exchanges between them really are examples of these socio-technical imaginaries that really shape, in our case, back to what we are talking about, you know, how we think about space exploration, astronomical research, and how it's portrayed or how it's understood in the societies. And of course, in many societies, we need that understanding because it's the taxpayers when they vote. And Europe is probably slightly better off, but in the United States, the funding of NASA is directly tied to not necessarily whether it's Democrats or Republicans in the White House, but it's tied to whether people think it's a waste of time rather than, and of course, Americans think that a lot of not very practical things are a waste of time and money. But so you need to convince the public that no, literally, taking 0.001% of your tax annually and giving it to NASA actually makes sense. So those socio-technical imaginaries are a place where all kinds of ideas about, cosmos are, and not only cosmos, any kind of science and technology are shaped. Now, there are several things that I could say here, how video games, those space astronomical video games fit into that. One of them is that, and I already mentioned how some of them kind of visualize both real or fictional star systems, universes, and so on. But it's important to remember that the video games are not the first of it. That the first example of that in fact, in the last 150 years, there has been a long line of cultural products that sort of related or worked with science, although very often took various liberties. So you could hypothetically, if you have this sort of spectrum online where on one end you have like pure imagination about out there, and on the other end you have some sort of degree of accuracy, right? So if you start, of course, for instance, if you start with Hollywood filmmaking and television, and again, this would most typically be science fiction, right? Most of it is fairly imaginary, and sure, if you look at movies like Interstellar, that is again something that Kip Thorne worked on and kind of consulted on. But for every Interstellar, there's like 100 other space opera movies or television series, where if you look at it, it's completely ridiculous in terms of the actual science, like the most basic to do, I don't know, with gravity or atmospheric science and so on. But but they look great, especially as special effects get cheaper and more available, right? Then you could look at early astronomical photography, and I mean early, almost as early as the medium of photography itself. So this is mid 19th century, and kind of a very curious example of someone who really mixed imagination with science, or kind of looking up there, was James Naismith, an English. Well, he kind of styled himself as an astronomer, although he wasn't trained in any way properly. But Naismith became, starting in the late 1840s, and then in the 1850s and the 1860s, going into the 1970s, he became famous in England and beyond as someone who observed the moon and the phases of the moon, and took a lot of early photography, although at that point you can imagine that this was fairly primitive and the magnifications weren't that great. But he also became popular as the author of these things. And I'll explain why I say things rather than photographs, right? So this is an example, but he produced like dozens and dozens of those. Group of lunar mountains, which actually looks fairly 1874. Of course, there are telescopes then, and of course, there is already fairly good photography. But of course, there is no photography that can actually give you that kind of detail, right? And of course, what happened is Naismith, while he did a lot of lunar photography, he actually made those using plaster and various sort of gypsum and plaster, and then sort of styled them after how he imagined or what he thought he saw, and then he photographed those. And kind of presented it as a kind of a lunar photography. Now, the funny thing is that pretty mostly everyone knew that these weren't real photographs of the moon. So there are, for instance, letters from Isabel Herschel, the daughter of an astronomer, who actually supposedly writing on the behalf of the father, who was too busy to write back to Naismith. But Isabel Herschel kind of praising Naismith for the detail, the realism, and how it contributed to understanding, astronomy and so on. And so he was really popular for those. But from our perspective, these were at best, semi-rigorous, imaginary recreations of what the actual lunar surface looked like. But they passed as photographs, and of course, by the late 19th century, photography is considered as a kind of something that reflects the world. We know it's more complicated than that, but something that is scientifically real rather than painting or drawing, which could be sort of anything could be made up. So that's astronomical. Then of course you could think, further we are slowly moving towards the accuracy. There is, of course, it's not a huge sector. It's something that I call planetarium shows, right? Something that occasionally we can see in Copernic, right? Although I don't think I've seen anything of the kind that, for instance, the planetarium in Prague does, where they organize every now and then sort of big concerts. It's usually electronic music that plays really well with those planetarium shows. And again, a lot of it will be actually based on the actual science, on the data we have, although there is a question of colors and visualizations. I will talk about that in a second. But it's also created into this sort of continuous 1 hour long show where the participants kind of look up and they see those huge cosmic events unfolding, in real time. Of course, again, timescales are completely fictional, right? In real time, accompanied by, electronic music and this sort of a mood, right? Although a lot of them, from what I understand, are kind of based in. And then last but not least, right, there is something that I very collectively, the official name would be Hubble Web Imagery. I sometimes like to say Hubble Web Porn, because kind of people get excited when they look at these images. And, I assume that everyone knows that we're talking about that kind of images that first Hubble had been producing since it really started producing these images. And we do know that while, this is what the public understands, of course, the fact that NASA makes those available for free, even for commercial use. So images like that, and there are literally like tens of thousands of those over several decades. They have appeared on posters, book covers, sort of advertisements for all kinds of things. We do know that, of course, this is not what the universe looks like. There is a very significant degree of still, of course, rigorous, but imaginary transformation, to do with colors, although from what I understand, very often, the colors will reflect various, I don't know, the gas, temperature of gases, or, levels of all kinds of radiation. So there is a kind of a logic there, but of course, hypothetically, if you had a spaceship and, flew out there, you would never actually see something like that, right? But there is there are several books, very interesting books, but actually discuss the production and the logic of these Hubble. At that point, Hubble Webb is, of course, very recent images. One, Elizabeth Kessler, picturing the cosmos, and she actually interviewed a lot of scientists responsible for producing those public outreach images and talk to them, how they think about it. There is apparently, at least in the American community, astronomical community, a very deep rift whether these actually serve good purpose, or whether they are kind of a candy eye or eye candy images that sort of deceive people of what the serious stuff out there is. So there are divisions, but it's interesting. Kessler, among other things, talks about how these images, while they do portray various, I don't know, nebulae or galaxies and so on, but actually the way they are visualized is very much influenced by a number of earlier visual conventions that have nothing to do with astronomy. For instance, 19th century landscape painting, and how, of course, that served specific American purposes of sort of westward expansion, colonialism, and the same concerns with the original NASA program, which we may think about as, of course, committed to science, which it is, and sort of search for knowledge. But of course, NASA was very much a child of a space race, which was a political project rather than purely scientific project, and so forth. As I said, there is a disagreement. So, for instance, James Elkins, who in that book, 6 Stars from the End of Representation, has one chapter on astronomy, but he does talk further in him not about these eye candy images, but the actual those blurry, dark images that we can take if we actually take images in the optical spectrum, which we probably not probably, but you definitely know this is not even, it's not even the visual spectrum, but a lot of the imaging is happening. But it's definitely, in terms of accuracy, that Hubble Webb imagery is probably as rigorous as it gets out there in culture outside the astronomical community. When you compare games to that, very interestingly, depending on the title, you could find games that actually span, which makes them interesting in itself, span the whole spectrum. So you will find specific games that will be, kind of the equivalents of Hollywood filmmaking. So supposedly set in space, but completely made up. But there will be those, like a couple of examples that I showed that would be super rigorous. So it's a visualization, and how that visualization is part of those imaginaries that really shape social perception of science is one way, or one reason why we should sort of pay attention to video games. I don't have long. The second one is the fact that video games, unlike film or television or any other medium, are interactive. Or the nice, in game studies, the nice term is that they are performative and simulatory. Meaning that whatever you do, of course, in many of them, there are stories, and some of these stories may be very similar to Hollywood movies. But these stories rely on us as players doing things. And of course, that our involvement in games can be very different depending on the game genre or game titles. We may kind of see ourselves as a kind of an avatar, but sometimes we are not part of the game, but we still direct things. We direct things within a game, and that sort of interaction, rather than sort of more passive observation, makes a lot of difference, because also games, and this is a lengthy quote, I won't be reading that, and it's from a book by a researcher who actually is more interested in sort of lower scale, so a single planet systems. But what games, at least some of the titles, force us to is to work at these different levels of scales, or what she calls here multi-scalar play, that depending on the title, we may be sort of, kind of devising entire star systems, but we may also be contending with various challenges within a single planet and the balance of, ecosystems and atmosphere and geosphere and sort of planetary dependencies. And there is no other medium that really forces us. It doesn't mean that most or all games do that, but some of the best really force us to sort of very actively sort of interact and sort of shape what happens. And that sort of active participation can potentially be a beginning of kind of knowledge acquisition or learning or kind of a change in your mindset. Then the fact that, and this is sort of related to the previous point, that games, unlike other media, rely on repetition a lot. There are probably many more people who replay their favorite games than people who rewatch their favorite movies. Although maybe I'm not. I don't think there is rigorous empirical research on that. But games are inherently replayable, but also they may be replayable because certain challenges pose, you try again and again how to, I don't know, pass that room, or how to get to that system, or how to obtain something, how to construct something, and so forth. And of course, repetition in general, we know, and again, in the context of cognition and knowledge acquisition is very important because it goes against this sort of the forgetting curve. Most information there's a lot of, again, psychological empirical theory how any kind of knowledge, but also any kind of habit of mind that we have, when it happens once, we may forget it, it doesn't really imprint on us, but once it's repeated, which games at least very often do or compel us to do, then it may change our, perceptions, our mindsets, sometimes very specific skills, or may force us to acquire specific kinds of knowledge, including the ones, for instance, that are related to the universe. And last but not least, and this is my last point, and this is where games are also very different from other kinds of space stories or science fiction stories about space, is that they rely on procedurality, right? And very, very quickly, of course, most games have some sort of a narrative, and that narrative, once you play a game, you get it, right? I mean, you have this little, I don't know, nation, and you want to get off the planet, and you need to construct a rocket, and then you need to calculate your, I don't know, escape velocity, for instance, right? That's simple. And of course, narratives can be very powerful, and we do know that narratives can, I don't know, unite or divide people very generally. But we don't need to go into that. But of course, games have another level. They have a level of what is popularly known as mechanics. So something that's not visible, but something that governs of what's possible, or what will happen if you do this. What kind of actions and activities are rewarded, and what kind of activities or decisions are punished. And this is something that is called, and there's the last part, procedural rhetoric. And of course, rhetoric as a kind of an art of convincing people or installing, ideas in people's minds, has a very long history. Of course, with a basic kind is a, verbal rhetoric, that's a political speech during a political rally, right? And of course, visual rhetoric has been asked for a long time, all kinds of posters for whatever political events, and not only will engage in visual rhetoric, but games, unlike other types of narratives, including science fiction narratives, have procedural rhetoric, which means that underneath the story, whatever it is, there's a level of mechanics, those dependencies, sometimes extremely, insanely complex. Like you can imagine, the effort going into decoding in one of those planets in No Man's Sky, the 18 quintillion planet game, that when you're on a planet and each of them will have a separate one, but what happens if you start doing this? If you cut down a lot of trees, if you start killing one type of animal, will it sort of disbalance the ecosystems and biomes and so forth, right? And part of the game is, how most people play is actually sort of learning or decoding how this is actually set up within that game. But of course, you can make, and of course when you look at procedural rhetoric, you look at, what kind of logically possible options are present or absent. What the technology tree, so this is kind of a colloquial name of, you know, when you develop in various games, craft various technologies, what you need to do to get a better tool, and that tool will help you build a sort of machine, and that machine will allow you to, and so on and so forth. And how you set them up, of course, is not neutral. I mean, it does betray certain preconceptions of how you think about, for instance, technological development, how the win-lose conditions are set up. You know, what is punished and rewarded. And sometimes games, or very often games, actually say one thing in the narrative layer, but in the mechanics, in the procedural layer, they can actually be making, you know, they can be habituating you to completely different behaviors. They may force you, if you want to win, and most people who play games want to win or get to the end. If you want to win, you actually have to succumb to a sort of different logic that forces you to do things you may not like. But there's the repetition again, right? But you do that because you want to get to the end of that game. And again, you know, this may not be, astronomy may not be the most immediate, you know, area in which you would use that sort of procedural rhetoric, but potentially you could. But this is the kind of a layer which makes games very unique among all kinds of media, but also very dangerous, because most people precisely pay attention to the, you know, to the level of a narrative and just, oh, will I get to the end? But of course, the repetition of certain acts, of certain activity, of certain, you know, sort of developmental cycles or developmental trees, you know, does imprint on our minds very often unconsciously, which potentially makes them very powerful rhetorical tools. And sometimes, of course, you know, that sort of rhetorical procedural rhetoric may concern, this is again a Kerbal space program, may actually force you to, yeah, kind of learn at least the basics, right, of space flight, or what kind of basic, you know, calculations you need to know if you want, I don't know, to calculate orbital insertion, right? And but you could say, you know, that's good. Actually, it forces people to actually have some basics of physics or mathematics and so on. But in the same way, the sort of procedural rhetorical level can force you in other games, and this is again Mass Effect that I mentioned at the very beginning, actually have a sort of acquire logic where, again, without going into details, one of the ways in which you build up your capacity in that game, you mine various moons and planets for raw materials. And you do that from orbit, and eventually you just send probes. And eventually when you start with a planet that's rich, you know, a fictional planet, of course, you remember that's one of these entire fictional universes. But when you start with a planet that's rich, and then, you know, at the end, if you send enough probes, the planet becomes depleted. Very interestingly, within the game, these planets are actually inhabited, and there is information that tells you that the population of this planet relies on mining. So what you're actually doing from orbit is actually undercutting the life from these, sure, fictional, but the whole game is a fiction, it's a story, right? And of course, you know, when you do it often enough, you know, you could, you know, very subconsciously kind of develop a conviction, yeah, it kind of doesn't matter that we mine things in Congo or that we mine things in, I don't know, Southeastern Asia, as long as we get our stuff because we need for our machines. And, you know, the repetition and the sort of normalization of things like that, that's again procedurally, you know, that could be a potentially kind of a dark aspect of a procedural rhetoric. And I'll stop here, and maybe there will be questions or protests. Thank you.
Thank you. Cool. Any questions, comments? So I have a first question about the Polish game dev. I'm not an expert, definitely, but it's an important part of our, say, economy. Yeah.
It is.
And so how Polish game dev is seen in an arena of like general game dev? That's my first question. And another one, any examples of using space related topic game dev?
That's an interesting, I mean, maybe I'll start with the second part. I mean, there are probably some, but I can't think of a major game made in Poland, and there are a lot of major games made that would actually be about space. Whether it's a reflection of our, you know, how, I mean, of course, we have a lot of astronomers and astrophysicists, and we know that some of the Polish centers do work in various or involved in the kind of development of space programs, but as a country, we haven't had one as such, kind of a proper. So I don't think there are major games, that would be even vaguely space related. So the biggest titles will be down here on the ground, fictional. There are some that will play with planetary sciences, or the questions of the balance. So for instance, there are two of them now, the game Frostpunk, which is more about managing, but the basic premise of Frostpunk is that somehow we have entered the new ice age, and you, as a kind of a governor of colony, have at the center of colony, there's this huge furnace that provides heat and energy, and then you have to manage the whole thing to keep people alive, because the temperature outside is sort of brutal. So there are some elements of how much heat you have to produce, and what sort of resources it takes to produce that heat, and how you actually distribute. So this is probably the closest to that kind of rigorous thinking. I don't know whether it would be thermodynamics here, or just basically energy management, something else. So, but most other really famous games are not really that big on science of any kind. So of course, the two biggest successes, Polish successes, would be the Witcher franchise, which The Witcher 3 was the most awarded game in the history of the medium ever, anywhere. And then of course there is the same company produced Cyberpunk 2077. So, but that's even less rigorous in any kind of. But they have been fairly. I mean, Witcher huge, Cyberpunk slightly less so, but big successes. There are other developers, but I don't think they are. I don't think there is space in all. I may be mistaken, and I may be missing some smaller games, but I'm not sure if it says something about Polish game industry or Polish. Whatever.
Anyone?
I just wanted to comment that it was a great overview of some of the games, especially the ones which actually hold the real data, because that's what we really need. Very often I talk to astronomers, especially within the Gaia space mission, is that we need to visualize the data, and Gaia data is particularly bad visualization because we don't have any images. So this one, actually, I'm about to buy this one. And it has Gaia in it. There are some people developing some tools, astronomers, and they build some tools for visualization. It's called Gaia Sky, actually, but it's nowhere near to what people do in the gaming industry, right? So one astronomer, one software developer, and it's a kind of heavy stuff they develop. This looks much better. So
Sure. I mean, there is this whole, because of course when I kept saying games, right, and that denomination seems to be clear, but in fact it's actually not. We like to think about games, okay, these pieces of software that doesn't matter what the story is, that will create some sort of opening conditions, and then they will, usually you have to discover the rules of the world and somehow progress. And this can be either through crafting or accumulation of points, but eventually you get to some sort of final stage, which may be, where you have a win condition and you kind of complete it. And, there may be very, right. But of course there are a lot of, games or software or media objects. That's a kind of a very neutral, ecumenical, agnostic, so media objects that for all purposes look like games. They are developed on the same game engines. And incidentally, for instance, Unreal Engine 5, by now it's actually, which was the game engine developed to build games, but it's probably now, in terms of statistically, it's used more often outside the gaming industry. So the entire architectural design profession nowadays, like 90% uses actually Unreal Engine 5, which was developed to make fictional worlds because of the physics and the kind of how it projects and generates space and so on. So some of those may look like games. They may be built on using the same modules, the software, but they lack what some people think is the essence of games, like you have a win condition of a win of any kind or fail. They may be those interactive environments in which things happen, but these things can't be sort of quantified in terms of, you know, any kind of progress, for instance, like exploration. And a lot of these sort of large, even if they are kind of a fictional, set in fictional universes, even those that are not really based on catalogs, but I do think they are kind of very useful because, if anything, they sort of communicate to their players, and very often these are relatively young people who have very little clue about very few things, right? But communicate that, you know, there is actually value, that there is this wonder and awe in just kind of looking at things that are far away, that may not be practically useful in any way, right? Because that's how a lot of people think, you know, out there in the street. I certainly don't, but that's how people think about astronomy. I mean, what good is it to know that there is this exoplanet that may even have potentially, we think, sort of, you know, conditions suitable for life, if it's like, you know, 14 light years away, right? So that's right. And of course, the games or software media objects like that may communicate indirectly. It's not something like preaching, but yeah, that sort of it's good to be astonished and sort of charmed by the beauty of, yeah, other planets or other moons, even if practically this doesn't mean that we are going to go there, right? So that's this kind of a soft subconscious communication of science, and you know, a lot of that underlies the kind of space exploration of the space, you know, charting that, you know, something that Elon Musk, of course, wouldn't understand, but yeah.
I don't see any hands up. I'm sure Paweł will be happy also to answer questions after we finish official seminar. So thank you very much. Thanks a lot. Next week we have a visit. Next week we have a visitor from Paris, right? About microlensing. Again, talk. Also a little announcement that tomorrow we're going to organize a talk in a botanical garden. Mateusz will lead the little walk to exoplanets exhibition that he prepared. So if anyone is interested, please contact Mateusz. And there's a black notebook somewhere there. You know what to do with that. Thank you very much.
Bo mówiłeś o Interstellar, mówiłeś o Kalifornii. Tam była taka sytuacja, że faktycznie